The alkali dust was a shroud, clinging to everything with a gritty persistence that scoured the throat raw. It coated the parched timbers of the buildings, settled in the deep ruts of the street, and hazed the brutal, indifferent sun. For Alara, huddled in the sliver of shade between the livery and the assayer's office, the dust was the taste of grief, the texture of fear. Her breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, each one a fresh agony in her constricted chest. Through the narrow gap, she watched him. He was a stranger, a man whose presence was as solid and unyielding as the granite mesas that clawed at the horizon. He moved with a quiet economy, his worn leather chaps and dust-caked hat speaking of long miles and a life lived in the saddle. He was watering his horse, a powerful roan, at the town's only public trough, his back to the main street, seemingly oblivious to the suffocating tension that held the town of redemption in its grip. Her town. It wasn't a town of redemption. It was a place of judgment, of quick cruelty veiled in sanctimony. Inside her mind, the images replayed, a hellish loop of splintered wood and her mother's cries. The faces of the men, Jedediah Thorne with his greedy, pious eyes, the Miller brothers, hulking and witless, loomed like gargoyles in her memory. They'd called her mother a thief, a cheat, a convenient scapegoat for the blight that had withered their crops. But Alara knew the truth. They wanted the small parcel of land her father had left them, the one with the year-round spring. They had come not with the law, but with rope and self-righteous fury. The memory of the coarse hemp biting into her mother's wrists, the sickening thud as they dragged her from their small home, was a physical weight in Alara's stomach. She had slipped out the back, a ghost in the chaos, her mother's final, desperate shriek, "Run!" propelling her into the suffocating alleyway. Now, every shadow felt like a threat, every distant shout a prelude to her own capture. The stakes were absolute. Her mother's life, and her own. There was no one else. No family left, no friends who would dare stand against Thorne. There was only this stranger, a man who represented the slimmest, most impossible sliver of hope. He dipped his hands in the cool water, splashing his face, the gesture so mundane, so normal, it felt like it belonged to another world. Her world had ended an hour ago. She had to move. To stay was to be found. To be found was to share her mother's fate. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass, Alara pushed herself from the wall. Her bare feet made no sound on the hard-packed earth as she emerged from the shadows. The man's head lifted, his movements ceasing. He didn't turn, but she knew he was aware of her, the way a wolf is aware of a rabbit freezing in the undergrowth. She stopped a few feet behind him, her voice a dry, rasping thing, a sound she barely recognized as her own. It was a murmur, almost lost to the wind. "Save my mama," the man remained still, his back a wall of faded denim. His horse flicked its ears, sensing the tremor in her words. She took another shaky step, the desperation tearing through her paralysis. "Please." They bound her. In ropes. The silence that followed was immense, heavier than the sun. He did not turn to face her. Instead, his gaze seemed to be fixed on something far beyond the trough, out in the bleached expanse of the plains. Alara watched the taut line of his shoulders, the slow clench of his hand where it rested on the damp wood of the trough. She saw not a dismissal, but a weighing, a deep and silent calculation. He was an outsider, untouched by the town's venom, and in that moment, she understood that his detachment was her only currency. He was a man accustomed to violence. It was written in the way he stood, in the coiled readiness that lay just beneath his stillness. He finally turned, not his whole body, but just his head. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met hers. They held no pity, only a stark, penetrating assessment. He took in her torn dress, the wild terror in her face, the streaks of dirt on her cheeks that traced the path of recent tears. He looked past her, toward the center of town, from where the low murmur of a gathering crowd could be heard. He didn't ask for a name. He didn't ask for an explanation. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "Where?" It was not a promise. It was a demand for information, a single word that acknowledged the crisis without yielding to its emotion. Alara pointed with a trembling hand toward the makeshift jail, a squat, ugly building baking in the sun. They took her there. Thorn. He said they'd hold a trial by sundown, a trial. It was a mockery, a word used to grant a veneer of civility to a lynching. He held her gaze for another long second, and in that look, an unspoken truth passed between them. He saw the whole sordid story in her eyes. Taking the reins of his horse, he swung himself into the saddle in one fluid motion. He looked down at her, a towering figure against the searing sky. Stay out of sight, it was a command, not a suggestion. Then, without another word, he urged the roan forward, not with haste, but with a deliberate, unnerving calm, riding directly toward the heart of the poison that had consumed her world. The wait was a unique form of torture, a stretching of time into a thin, brittle wire of suspense. Hidden in the hayloft of the livery, peering through a grimy pane of glass, Alara watched the street. The air grew thick with a foul energy as more men gathered near the jail, their voices a low, angry drone. She saw Thorn, preening like a vulture, his hands gesturing grandly as he stoked the crowd's fervor. Then she saw the stranger. He dismounted in front of the jail, tying his horse to the hitching post with the same unhurried precision he did everything else. He did not draw his weapon. He simply stood there, a solitary, quiet challenge to the mob's authority. The confrontation was muted from her distance, a pantomime of gestures and postures. She saw Thorn's face contort with rage, his finger jabbing toward the stranger. She saw the stranger shake his head, his stance unwavering. It was a battle of wills played out in the oppressive heat. Then, the jailhouse door opened, and her breath caught in her throat. Two men shoved her mother forward. She was alive, but the sight broke something deep inside Alara. Her mother, a woman of fierce pride and quiet dignity, was slumped, her spirit dimmed, the ropes still chafing her raw wrists. The hope that had flared so brightly moments before guttered and died, replaced by the cold ash of reality. He had been too late. The evil was already done, the humiliation complete. The stranger spoke again, his words lost to the wind, but his intent was clear. He was trying to bargain, to intervene. Thorn laughed, a cruel, barking sound that carried even to the loft. He gestured, and the Miller brothers shoved the stranger back. It was over. The man had tried and he had failed. He remounted his horse and rode slowly, deliberately out of town, never once looking back. The crowd's jeers followed him, but he seemed immune to them. And as he disappeared over the rise, Alara felt the last of her strength abandon her. They would hang her mother, and then they would come for her. The sun began its slow, merciless descent, painting the sky in hues of blood and bruised purple. Alara knew she could not stay. With a final, soul-crushing look at the scene below, she slipped from the hayloft and ran, not toward the open plains, but deeper into the forgotten alleyways, seeking the cover of darkness. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, collapsing behind a collapsed adobe wall at the edge of town. The sounds of the mob a faint, horrific pulse in the distance. She curled into a tight ball, a vessel of pure, silent grief, waiting for the end. She didn't know how long she lay there before the sound of a hoof fall on loose shale made her flinch. She looked up, her heart seizing with terror. Looming over her was the silhouette of a horse and rider against the star-dusted sky. It was him, the stranger. He had come back. He dismounted and stood over her, his face obscured by shadow. He said nothing, simply extended a hand. She stared at it, confused, wary. She started, her voice breaking. "I know," he said, his tone flat, devoid of emotion. He had seen it too. He had seen them lead her mother to the lone cottonwood tree. He had waited, out of sight, for the inevitable. And then he had come back for her. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. His retreat from the town had not been a surrender. It was a strategic withdrawal. He had come back for the only part of the equation he could still affect. Her. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her small, trembling hand into his large, calloused one. His grip was firm, grounding. He pulled her to her feet and, without a word, lifted her onto the saddle before swinging up behind her. She was rigid, a statue of shock and sorrow pressed against his chest. They rode out into the vast, indifferent darkness of the desert, leaving the town of redemption and the smoldering ruins of her life behind them. The journey that followed was marked by a profound and heavy silence. The man, whose name she eventually learned was Silas, spoke only when necessary, his words sparse and practical. Eat, drink, we rest here. He was a creature of the wilderness, reading the land as if it were a map, finding hidden springs and sheltered arroyos where they could pass the nights undetected. Elara existed in a fog of grief, a passenger in her own life. The world was muted, its colors leached away, its sounds distant. But slowly, through the haze, she began to observe him. She saw the way he cared for his horse before himself, the patience with which he cleaned his pistol by the firelight each night, the constant, sweeping gaze that missed nothing. He was a man wrapped in a formidable solitude, yet his actions bespoke a deep-seated code of honor. He shared his meager rations without comment, always giving her the larger portion. One evening, when a sudden, cold rain swept across the plains, he removed his heavy duster and draped it over her shoulders, enduring the chill himself with stoic indifference. Trust was not a decision she made, but a thing that grew in the spaces between their silences, nurtured by these small, unspoken kindnesses. It was a fragile root finding purchase in the barren soil of her despair. She began to mend. Not her heart. That was a shattered ruin she could not yet bear to examine, but the practical things. She learned to patch the tears in their clothes with a needle from his saddlebag, to gather edible plants she recognized from her mother's teachings, to build a small, smokeless fire. These simple tasks anchored her to the present, pulling her, inch by inch, from the drowning depths of the past. One night, as they sat by the flickering flames, the vast, star-strewn sky arching above them, she finally spoke a sentence that was not born of immediate need. "They'll come after us." It was a statement of fact, not a question. Silas looked up from the piece of wood he was carving, his eyes catching the firelight. "I know, they'll want the deed. It's all they ever wanted. Let them come," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a boast. It was a simple, chilling statement of readiness. And for the first time since her world had shattered, a feeling other than fear or grief stirred within her. It was a flicker of something hard and sharp, a nascent anger, a will to not just survive, but to see this through. She looked at this quiet, formidable man who had plucked her from the ashes, and understood that their journey was not just an escape. It was a reckoning, waiting for them somewhere out in the darkness. They followed the winding path of a shallow river for 3 days, the landscape slowly shifting from barren plains to broken country, a labyrinth of rust-colored canyons and sharp-edged mesas. The water was a lifeline, but it was also a trail. Silas knew it. Elara felt it in the increased tension in his shoulders, in the way his hand rarely strayed far from the worn grip of his Colt. The ghosts of redemption were behind them, their greed a palpable force stretching across the miles. He had started teaching her things, not with lectures, but with quiet demonstrations. He showed her how to read the signs of pursuit. A freshly turned stone, a flock of birds startled from a thicket. He put his spare knife in her hand, showing her how to hold it, how to use its weight. "Not for fighting," he had said, his voice low. "For an advantage." For a chance, the words settled in her, cold and heavy. She was not a fighter, but she was no longer merely a victim, either. The quiet girl who had hidden in an alley was being stripped away with every mile, burned off by the harsh sun and the constant, thrumming threat of what followed. The attack came at dawn, just as the sky was beginning to pale from black to a bruised violet. They were camped in a narrow wash, protected on 3 sides by steep rock walls. Elara was awake, stoking the embers of the fire for warmth, when Silas suddenly went rigid. He moved without a sound, pressing her back against the rock face, his hand signaling silence. Then she heard it, the scuff of a boot on gravel from the ridge above. Thorn had found them. There were 4 of them, silhouettes against the rising sun. Thorn and the 2 Miller brothers, plus another man she didn't recognize. Nowhere left to run, Silas. Thorn's voice was triumphant, echoing in the enclosed space. Give us the girl and the deed, and we'll let you ride out. Silas didn't answer. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer cocking unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. He pushed Alara toward a cluster of boulders. Stay down, he whispered, his eyes never leaving the men on the ridge. The first gunshot exploded the quiet, a rock chip stinging Alara's cheek. Silas returned fire, his movements economical and deadly. He was not a man who wasted motion or bullets. One of the Miller brothers cried out and fell from the ridge. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the deafening roar of gunfire. It was a chaotic, terrifying whirlwind of noise and violence. Silas was impossibly fast, a blur of controlled action, but he was pinned down, outnumbered. Thorn and the others were using the high ground, raining fire down into the wash. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Silas's shirt, and he grunted, a flicker of pain crossing his face. In that instant, Alara's world narrowed. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now joined by a fierce, protective rage. This man was fighting for her. He was bleeding for her. She would not cower behind a rock while he died. She remembered the knife. She remembered his words. For a chance. She saw their horses tethered loosely to a scrub brush further down the wash, left there during their stealthy approach. It was a desperate, foolish idea, but it was the only one she had. Keeping low, she scuttled from the cover of the boulders, her heart pounding against her ribs. The gunfire was focused on Silas's position. No one saw her. She reached the horses, her hands shaking as she pulled the knife from her belt. With a raw cry that was part terror, part war cry, she slashed at the rump of Thorn's horse. The animal screamed and bolted, crashing through the brush, its panic spreading to the other mounts. They tore free of their tethers, a stampede of terrified horseflesh thundering through the narrow wash. The diversion was total. The men on the ridge swore, their attention ripped from Silas to their escaping transportation. It was the advantage Silas needed. He rose from cover, firing 2 shots in quick succession. The second Miller brother fell. Thorn, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, fired one last wild shot before scrambling away, his remaining man close behind. Their escape on foot now a desperate, hopeless prospect in this wilderness. Silence descended, thick and ringing. Silas stood, his pistol still aimed at the empty ridge. He lowered it slowly, his chest heaving. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. She stood by the remnants of the tethers, the knife still clutched in her hand, her knuckles white. He walked toward her, his eyes taking in the knife, her wild hair, the fierce determination set in her jaw. He stopped in front of her and gently took the knife from her grasp. For a long moment, they just stood there, the rising sun casting long shadows at their feet. The immediate danger was over. The ghosts had been faced. Weeks turned into a month, the miles spooling out behind them like thread from a shuttle, weaving a new life from the tattered remnants of the old. They traveled north into territory where the air was cooler and the land was kinder, cloaked in pine and aspen. The harsh reds and browns of the desert gave way to deep greens and the silver flash of clear-running streams. They found it by chance. A small, abandoned cabin nestled in a high meadow, its stone chimney still solid, its roof mostly intact. It had the feel of a place long forgotten, a sanctuary from a world that had grown too loud and too cruel. The silence here was different from the silence of the desert. It was a living thing, filled with the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a hawk. Here, the slow work of healing truly began. They fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Silas hunted and chopped wood, his quiet competence a comforting constant. Alara tended to the cabin, patching the roof with fresh sod, cultivating a small garden with seeds Silas had traded for in a town 2 weeks back. The work was hard, grounding. It left her hands calloused and her body tired, but it filled her days with purpose. She learned the landscape of his face, the fine lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, the faint scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the way his jaw set when he was concentrating. And she knew he was learning hers, too. He saw the fear finally receding from her eyes, replaced by a steady calm. He saw the strength in her hands as she kneaded dough for bread, the quiet smile that sometimes touched her lips when a deer and its fawn would appear at the edge of the meadow at dusk. The words between them remained few, but they were no longer necessary. Their communication existed in shared glances across the fire, in the cup of hot coffee he'd leave for her by the hearth in the morning, in the way she would leave a bowl of warm stew for him when he returned late from checking his trap lines. One evening, as the sun bled its final golden light across the meadow, she was sitting on the porch step, mending his shirt for the third time. He came and sat beside her, not speaking, just watching the mountains burn with alpenglow. The silence was comfortable, a shared blanket against the cooling air. "My father," he said, his voice quiet, startling her. He rarely spoke of himself. He was a lawman, a good one, but he was killed by men he trusted. They wanted the town for themselves. I was 16-inch Alara stopped sewing, her needle poised in midair. She looked at him, and for the first time saw past the stoic drifter to the boy who had lost everything. She saw the root of his solitude, the reason he stood apart from the world. He had seen the same darkness she had. He understood. She didn't offer empty condolences. The platitudes of her old life had no meaning here. Instead, she simply nodded, a slow, deep acknowledgement of his pain, a recognition of their shared history of betrayal. She set the shirt aside and looked down at her own hands. They were no longer the hands of a terrified girl. They were capable, strong. They could mend and plant, hold a knife and build a life. The ghosts of redemption were far away now, faded whispers in a land that no longer held power over her. A new story was being written here, in this quiet meadow, a story of resilience, of a trust earned in silence and sealed in shared survival. He had not just saved her life. He had given her the space to reclaim it for herself. A gentle breeze stirred the pines, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. She looked at Silas, at this man who had become her anchor, her partner, her quiet protector, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the unmistakable, unshakable sensation of being home. Hope was not a grand pronouncement, but a quiet, steady flame burning in the hearth of a forgotten cabin, a shared warmth against the coming night.